want to know this morning, how often do you feel the pressure to be great? And not just at one thing, but at most things you do. Is there a pressure to be great? And if not the best, at least in the top 10%. I want to read to you a quote from an article that was online just this week that is very representative of many articles that I seem to come across and are posted by people, particularly posted by young mothers. It's from Julia Roller at PracticingFamilies.com. She says, "A few years ago, I was out for a walk with my son, and we happened upon a little playground we'd never visited before. He hopped out of the stroller and started to play. After a few minutes of having the place to ourselves, several cars pulled up, and moms started unloading their small children all around Ben's age. I realized it was a playgroup meetup, and then I noticed that I knew a couple of the moms slightly. Those two women I knew invited me to stay and play with the group, but as more and more moms arrived, I realized I didn't feel at all comfortable. All of the moms were blonde and very well put together, even in their playground gear. I don't know what that is. There were a few moms who were also wearing workout clothes, but unlike me, they had clearly done their hair and makeup. I felt more sweaty and disheveled by the minute. I kept thinking in my head, one of these things is not like the other." And then she goes on to say that they left. I read this kind of thing so often. Apparently, there is great pressure, whether external or self-imposed, on especially parents these days to be the best, to always keep up, but not just parents. In our job, in our business, among our friends. You may remember, if you're one of our ladies, a part of ABW, a few Christmases ago, my wife was the speaker at the ABW Christmas tea. And she shared something similar. Here's what she said. "On social media, such as Facebook, there are so many things posted about women, working moms, stay-at-home moms, etc., on how to be the perfect this or the best that. There is Pinterest, a place where anyone can post these wonderful ideas for all aspects of your life. There are activities for your family, ways to decorate, games to play, and even speech pathology-based activities to use in therapy." My wife is a speech pathologist. "It is often the common person who posts these things, but it makes me think of Martha Stewart on steroids. It is not just some famous person you don't feel you have to live up to. It is a mom of 6 kids who is working and still manages to make specialized themed snacks for a party of all 6 while having a perfectly decorated Christmas tree and house." Now, I know it's not just moms, but they're the ones writing about it the most. Apparently, dads don't blog as much. You don't have to be a parent. Apparently, others don't blog about this as much. There's so much of this. There seems to be so much pressure to be great at anything, at all that you try to do. I guess part of the reason I chose to preach this sermon is because I, too, place this pressure on myself a lot. Now, you're not supposed to use your own children in a sermon illustration, so I'll just tell you that I know a boy who loves to tell me about, now, Lego Builder was a new one. He loves to tell me about what great sports player he's going to be. Now, the problem is it changes from day to day. I don't know whether to practice passing a football or pitching a baseball because it changes. But this boy that I happen to be talking about is really into the greatest sports athletes, and he has this book that's called a Top 10 book, and he has this obsession with who has the most passes, or who's the greatest this, or who's the greatest that. And he tells me a lot that he's going to be one of them. And you know what I struggle with? I struggle with telling him how few people make it without dashing his hopes. You know? I mean, I don't know that children understand a fraction of a percent. But that's how many are great athletes that everyone wants to be like and interview. But I don't want to dash hopes. And yet, there's this realistic part where you have to say, you're only talking about a very, very small part of the population. You know of the bell curve, right? If you had professors who graded on a curve, you know it was thrown off by the really smart kid in the class, right? The bell curve is what happens when you plot on a graph the points, take a population, whatever you're looking at, and plot all the points on anything you can quantify. You know, it could be something like temperature, or it can be something like grades, or maybe income, or that kind of thing. It's not always this perfect bell curve, but you're always going to get a hump where most people are. And on the bell curve, you have the very, very small part down near the bottom on the one side, the people who are really struggling with whatever we're measuring, and the part on the other side, the very, very small part, the people who are doing very well. But then there's the big hump. And this, to some, might sound like bad news, but I think it's actually good news that most of us live in the hump. Most of us, at most of what we do, are not really bad or really exceptional, but somewhere in that large gray part of people holding their own and very often doing their best, but if you measure it against everything else and everyone else, you are average. That's the whole problem, of course, isn't it, with measuring ourselves against everybody else, because usually we end up average. Maybe a little above, maybe a little below. We, as parents, we tell our children, don't compare yourself to other people. And why do we say that? Because adults, we do it all the time. I can remember a couple times in my life when it kind of occurred to me that, you know, I am just kind of lost in a sea of faces here on this planet. One of the first times was high school science, you know, when you're doing it biology, astronomy, and those things. And that was really one of the first times for me that I can remember where I said to myself, man, I'm just a speck of dust in this whole setup here. How small I am and how temporary my life is. And then another time was in college, because I'd gotten used to high school professors and teachers, I guess, and band directors that I really liked, and that were almost, some of them were almost like friends. I would talk to them and they knew me and liked me and would even help me when I was struggling. And then I got to that freshman statistics class, and he didn't give 2 cents about me. I was a number. I was, you know, he didn't care what my name was as long as I didn't put it on somebody else's paper. And every once in a while you realize, I'm one among many. One among many. And yet, we put so much pressure on ourselves to be great. Now, parents, we need to own up to this. Parents of today, this is how we look. Now, I don't know if this is a real picture or a staged one. Could very well be real. And you can only guess what's, you know, on this side, what's up there that everybody's filming. You know, something different has happened today. You know, imagine the time before the camera was even invented, when you were who you were, you knew who you knew, you did what you did, and you had no visual representation of it or visual memory, and neither did anybody else. And then we get cameras, and I think most of us remember the days of film. You take a picture, you develop your film, and then you get a physical picture, you put it in an album, and very often you keep this album, well, you put it in an album if you're more organized than me. You put it in an album and you keep it in your home or your office, and every once in a while somebody comes by and you open it up and you look through it and say, oh, how cute, or maybe not cute, whatever it is, and then you close it and put it away until the next time. Such a different reality from what we have today, where many of us own a device with which you can take a picture at any moment, at any time, and post it immediately to the couple hundred or whatever friends you have on social networks. And it's interesting because, if you think about this from the perspective of the children, it's really the first generation growing up with the iPhones and the smartphones and all of this. From their perspective, sometimes it must be that whenever they do a new thing, put on a new outfit, or start something new, they are Facebook celebrities. And I've actually heard of kids doing something and saying to their parents, take a picture of this and put it on Facebook, right? I've just been wondering to myself, see, the positive side of me says, it is so great that we are able to share all of these pictures and moments with so many people so quickly. The pessimistic side of me says, we're raising a generation of narcissists. And it's maybe a combination of both, I don't know. And I'm stepping on my own toe here because I do it too. But I wouldn't just be observing this if it was just me thinking and saying this. The problem is there are college professors out there who have made some observations about the kids coming into college today. And one of the big words that they use is maladapted. Here's what one lady said. She used to be the dean of Stanford. A heightened level of parental involvement in the lives of kids obviously stems from love, unquestionably a good thing. But by the time I had stepped down as dean at Stanford in 2012, I had interacted not only with a tremendous number of parents, but with students who seemed increasingly reliant upon their parents in ways that felt simply off. I began to worry that college kids, as college students had become known, were somehow not quite formed fully as humans. They seemed to be scanning the sidelines for mom or dad. And this is where she gets a little mean. Under-constructed, existentially impotent. College professor, right? Using big words. But then she goes on. Too many of us do some combination of over-directing, over-protecting, and over-involving ourselves in our kids' lives. We treat our kids like rare and precious botanical specimens and provide a deliberate, measured amount of care and feeding while running interference on all that might toughen and weather them. But humans need some degree of weathering in order to survive the larger challenges life will throw our way. I bring that up not as an indictment, because if it is, I'm indicted, but as a reminder of something that perhaps those of us in the digital age might have forgotten. There's so much pressure, it seems. Maybe we put it all on ourselves to measure up, to be great. But I think about what Tom Brokaw called The Greatest Generation. How many of you have read that book, The Greatest Generation? A few of you. How many of you are the greatest generation? Depression era and World War II. Oh, they don't want to raise their hands. Oh, there's a few out there. You know, those who were children or young adults in their heyday in the era of the Depression and World War II. I say this as a testimony. I came to this church as one of the pastors 9 years ago. When I came, I had had an experience with a number of things. I had already had experience preaching and teaching and doing youth ministry and music and all these kinds of things. I had not done a funeral. And so I've spent the last 9 years here. Part of my work has been conducting funerals for some of what you might consider the greatest generation. Now, I might be thinking a little younger than Brokaw was. I didn't read the book. But these people who I've had the privilege of sitting down with their families and hearing their stories, and sometimes looking at pictures, and even more recently, in the case of Gladys Trower, reading through a journal that she kept and that she wrote down about some of the landmark moments of her life. And I've been learning more and more about this generation, particularly from having the privilege and the honor of conducting the funerals. And I don't know if I can explain this, but I'm going to try. There's something about that generation in particular, not exclusive to them, but particularly about that generation. Not only did they know that they were one among many, not only did they understand that they had a role to play in their corner of the world, it contributed to the larger society, or a role to play, many of them serving in the military. Not only did they know that they lived their lives in the hump of the bell curve, but they were perfectly okay with that. I hope I'm getting this right. Tell me afterwards if I didn't. But this has been my reflection on this generation. A hard-working generation. A humble generation. People who sometimes did great things that they didn't really tell anyone about and is discovered after they've gone on to glory. I've looked at these pictures and heard these stories, and as a young person, someone of a much later generation, it has struck me. There was no problem with doing what you were put here to do, serving your family and your community, and living in the hump of the bell curve where most of us spend most of our time. There was really nothing of the talk that you hear today about young people finding themselves. Sometimes we go off or we quit our job to find ourselves. There was no finding yourself, there was finding a job. There was surviving. There was contributing to society and to your family. King Solomon was really one of the greatest, by some measure, people of Israel's monarchy. He built one of the greatest structures. Well, he didn't. Many workers did. One of the greatest temples that's described in the Bible. People had wonderful memories of it. But then, in his prayer of dedication, last week we heard about the prayer that Solomon prayed. God said, you can have whatever you want. And he said, wisdom, please. And then this week, he's praying a prayer of dedication over the temple. And as a part of that prayer, he says, Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built? They did the best they could. They built the greatest temple they could, and yet at the end of the day, he knew where it fell in the grand scheme of things. It's not that we don't or shouldn't do our best, but Solomon understood. We built this to understand the presence of God and to house the presence of God, but in the prayer of dedication, the heavens cannot even contain you. How much less this temple? The mind of humility. The psalmist wrote, this is one of my favorite lines in the Psalms, what is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them? The psalm writer saying, how can God, who is so much bigger, and care about me, who's just a speck of dust? All these phrases in the Bible, the grass withers and the flowers fall. These people realizing, having that sinking feeling, oh, in the grand scheme of things, we are so insignificant. And yet realizing that in God's eyes, not so insignificant. The old King James said, "What is man that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou visitest him?" And so here's what Paul said in Romans. "Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, or put pressure on yourself to be higher than you need to be, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you." And then he goes on to write one of the great phrases about spiritual gifts. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy. If it's serve, then serve. If it's teaching, then teach. If it's giving, then give. It's almost as if Paul is asking, what has God gifted you with? What are the one or two things that make you tick? What are the one or two things that you're really passionate about? God is trying to use those things right where you are. And it's not about being great. It's about using what God has equipped us with. It's sort of what Paul is saying. Or in other words, I think of it this way. Paul is saying, if you're trying to find where your corner of the world is, don't keep looking for that corner. The corner of the greatest and the best. Don't look for that corner. Look for this corner. That's not your corner of the world. This is. Where you are, what you've been given. And God simply asks that we give back what we have been given in humility and in service to others. So this is something of a call to take the pressure off for those of you who feel the pressure. It's not a call to slack off, which is what I did in college, by the way. The only thing that kept me above a 3.0 was marching band. It's not that. We do our best. Because as it says in one of the books of the Bible, whatever you do, it's in Colossians, whatever you do it as if for the Lord. But God didn't create us to be among the greatest. He created us to be His. Or you can think of it this way. One of my favorite sayings, cliches that I heard from my youth minister, and I never forgot it. God is not as much interested in your ability as He is your availability. Be available. We are all part of God's family. And God is not the one measuring all the people and the numbers to see if we are on this end or that end. We're the ones doing the measuring. We're the ones setting the bar where we all end up in the big middle average hump. What did it say when David was anointed? God does not look at the things you look at. God looks at the heart. And so we're called to serve in our spot on the map with the people God has placed before us, with the gifts that He has given us.